And today I'm really excited to share with you some of my recent work in exploring life's influence on Earth's mineralogy on a very sort of broad planetary scale. So I'm starting with some big questions. And the first one is, how does life affect the mineralogy of a planet? And can we quantify life's influence on the diversity, distribution, and character of minerals on the planet we know best, Earth? And will understanding life's imprint on Earth's mineralogy aid in our search for life elsewhere? I think these are hopefully questions that we're all broadly interested in this room. And I like to start out by telling you why I think minerals are one of the best ways to tackle these big questions in Earth and planetary science, especially as they pertain to understanding biosignatures on other planets. Not only are minerals really cool and beautiful, as you can see here in this photo, they also happen to be the oldest and most robust materials in our solar system. They basically give us a physical view. They are the only pieces of physical evidence to our most ancient geologic and biologic past. And likewise, minerals and life co-evolved. We've been hearing a little bit about that. I think we'll probably hear more. They're dramatically influencing each other. Not only are the minerals and the geochemical components that are present in the environment influencing life, but life is likewise dramatically changing the geochemical and therefore the mineralogical landscape of a planet, right? And fortunately for us, minerals are incredibly information rich, and they retain information about their formational conditions and any subsequent weathering and alteration they've undergone. In many cases, I think also they can tell us whether or not there's biogenic input into that formation. So I'm going to talk about two projects today. They're a part of the evolutionary system of mineralogy. This is work Bob Hazen and I have been doing for several years now. And there are lots of facets to this work, and I'd love to discuss them all with you over these next 2 weeks. But for now, I'll start by saying that the premise of this work is that minerals are incredibly information rich. And we don't often treat them this way. We often try and think about them in their simplest terms. We try to boil them down to the simplest way that we can understand them. But the fact is, they're incredibly complex materials. And if we can integrate their diverse data, it can give us this multidimensional, holistic systems scale perspective of the dynamic materials and processes that have occurred through deep time. So that's really the premise of the evolutionary system of mineralogy. The first aspect of this that I'm going to talk about started with a really big question that I think is it seems like an obvious question, but no one had really answered this before. And that is, what are all the ways minerals can form? What are all of the modes of mineralization that we know since the beginning of time and across our solar system? No one had really answered that question before. So we went to the primary literature and we tried to figure out what those might be for the nearly 5,700 mineral species that are known to exist. And we identified approximately 57 different modes of formation, and we arranged them more or less chronologically. So these are things like processes taking place in interstellar clouds, igneous processes, volcanic fumaroles, coal mineralization, and so on. So there are a lot of these things that I'm going to refer to as paragenetic modes. These are modes of mineralization. And when we brought together this data set, we identified 11,000 combinations of mineral and paragenetic modes. So this is what that data set looks like. This is available on the paper. Of course, I can email it to you if you're interested. Basically, each column is a paragenetic mode. Each row is a mineral, and if it has a 1, that mineral forms in that paragenetic mode. So this is available for you if you're interested, and if you have a certain mineral that you're keen on better understanding, you can go to the International Mineralogical Association's official list of mineral species, and you can actually see we've posted all the paragenetic modes there. So if you're into, say, pyrite, I'm going to show you that on here later, you can see all of the different ways in which pyrite forms, which is many. So we have this spreadsheet, and it's a very multidimensional data set, and it's pretty complex. So I wanted to think about how we could visualize and explore and characterize this system. And with that, we turned to mineral network analysis, which is something we've been using for several years now to understand complex systems. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with networks, but I'll just say a little bit about them. Networks are made up of nodes. Nodes are entities in your data set. So this, in our case, is going to be a mineral or a paragenetic mode. And nodes are are connected via links, and links signify a relationship between two nodes. So this could be that a mineral forms in a particular paragenetic mode, and these come together to create a network. So it could be a network of a certain deposit type that you're interested in, it could be a whole planet, or it could be all of mineralogy as we know it. You can have networks with one type of node, we call that a unipartite, two types of nodes, which we call a bipartite. I'm going to show you both of these kinds. And we can also do a lot of customization to throw on different attributes, so we can really see a lot of things going on in the system. So we can change the weights of the edges, we can change the color, size, shape, transparency of the nodes, and we can overlay about 8 different attributes of a system at once. We largely start out using this as a visual tool. This is how we kind of explore our data sets, but there are a lot of analytics that you can do either on the topology of these networks or on the back end, a lot of machine learning and things that you could do. Just to give you an idea of a couple of those most basic ones, we have local metrics. So these can tell us things about an individual node. These are things like degree. So how many connections does a given node have within the network? Betweenness, it can tell us how important is a node in terms of being a broker. Is it connecting two different disparate parts of a graph? Does it communicate between two systems? And eigenvector centrality, which is a measure of importance of a node given its relation to other important nodes. And I'm going to show you these later. So now, with that really brief introduction, let's look at some networks. So here you're seeing a graphical representation of the relationship between all known mineral species and their modes of formation in our solar system. It's a big graph. There are a lot of things going on. Just to orient you, the colored nodes represent paragenetic modes. So I said there were 57 of those. We grouped those into 11 groups. You can see here in this legend. There are things like primary mineralization, high temperature alteration, early biosphere minerals, and things like that. Because we don't want to show 57 colors, that would be really confusing. And the nodes that are brown represent mineral species, okay? And a link between a mineral and a paragenetic mode means that that mineral is known to form through that mechanism. There are a couple of topological things that I would like to point out as we are looking at this. First, you'll notice these nodes that kind of hang off the side of the network, they form in only one way. So that tells us that this mineral, we only know of one mechanism of formation, but it can also tell us something about deposits where you see high concentrations of minerals that only form in one way. So if we zoom into a couple of those, here we're looking at highly evolved igneous systems, agpaitic rocks, granite pegmatites, and you'll see they have a lot of minerals that form only in those environments. And what's that's telling us is that there's something unique happening there that is giving us a unique suite of minerals. In this case, these highly evolved igneous systems concentrate rare elements, and as a result, you end up with rare minerals, right? In contrast, if mineral nodes are pulled in towards the center, or if any of the nodes are pulled in towards the center, it means they're more connected, obviously, right? So if it's a mineral, it means that it forms in several different ways. If it is a paragenetic mode, it means it forms minerals that form in several different ways. Let's take a look at some systems that show that, some paragenetic modes that show that. Primary mineralizing environments in the Hadean, we can see that mafic, ultramafic systems, these things tend to be pulled in towards the center and tend to have minerals that they share between different paragenetic modes. This is also true of the Hadean hydrosphere. So we can see things like serpentinization, hot springs, low temperature alteration. These are pretty almost nearly in the middle, and so they share a lot of different paragenetic modes. Same with plate tectonics, a lot of shared modes there. So there's a lot more we could continue to explore in these networks, but I said we were going to look at life. So we're just going to kind of fast forward to look at biologically driven mineralization within this network. So I'd like to point out a couple of stats to start. 50% of all mineral species can form through modes that are mediated by life, and 34% form exclusively through biotic processes. Now, there are degrees of bioticness, if you will. So there are things like direct biomineralization, right? So microbial precipitation, guano minerals, things like this. And then there are things that are less direct. So it's life's influence on a larger system, things like oxidizing environment due to the great oxidation event and things like that. So we have kind of a degree of bioticness, right? But when you look at this network, you'll probably notice a couple of things. Firstly, we kind of have a bio corner, right? Everything is really kind of stuck over in this corner. And that's interesting because most biomineral, there are a few of them that form in only one type of environment, only one, they're connected to only one node, but most of them have at least two modes of formation. When I showed you other types of minerals, that is true for, they were pulled very much so into the center of the network, but we're not seeing that with biominerals. And that's because biominerals tend to form in other biologically mediated settings. But that doesn't necessarily have to be true. So it's interesting that we're seeing that trend. So we're getting this kind of biotic corner of the network. So why is that? There could be a lot of reasons. I'm wondering, is it that biologically driven mineralization is fundamentally different from that of purely geologic processes? And is the observed network topology, or this sort of subgraph within the network, a signature of life on Earth? I think the answer to those questions are probably yes, although I would love to discuss this with you more this week. And I really want to explore this. There's so much to explore here. And to start, I wanted to do that by looking at the system in a slightly different way. So I'm simplifying the network by transforming it into a unipartite graph with the nodes representing mineral species that are colored by whether they form in biotic systems. So those are the green nodes. In abiotic systems, the blue nodes, or in both, and those are the red nodes. They're sized according to degree, and you can see their node sizes aren't really telling us much, but that's going to change in a second. You'll also notice that there is immediately a trend line of bioticness through this network, right? We're going from abiotic very clearly into biotic as we move from right to left, which was interesting. So we started exploring some of the metrics that I mentioned earlier. So we can look at those local metrics. We can also look at global metrics and do things like community detection and so on. But this is still really early days, so we pretty much only made it as far as local metrics. These have just been generated in the past month or so. So I'm going to show you now what eigenvector centrality looks like. And you can see now there's a very clear trend of eigenvector centrality being higher as we move in that biotic trend line, right? So the more biotic the minerals are, the higher the eigenvector centrality is. And so just to remind you, eigenvector centrality is a local recursive metric that demonstrates the relative importance or influence of a node on the topology of a graph. So basically, what we're seeing here is that biotic minerals, despite the fact that there are many abiotic minerals that are just as central to the network, that form in more ways than biotic minerals, that biotic minerals happen to be the most important nodes in this network. So why is that happening? Is this a signature of biologic activity on our planet's mineralogy? And can we expect to see similar patterns of mineralization and mineral relationships on other geologically active rocky bodies? Again, I think the answer to that is yes, but I think there are a lot of caveats, especially with the latter part of that question. And so we're thinking about this, and I'm going to tell you some of the evaluations we're going through, and I hope that you can also be thinking of some things that you can help me with exploring these. So we're trying to think about, is biotic mineralization more continuous and therefore more opportunistic or flexible than abiotic systems, right? Can organisms exhibit more flexibility? Does this trend hold true when mineral abundance or frequency of occurrence is introduced? So what I've shown you here is, you know, every mineral is basically weighted the same. But if you were to actually add the abundance of what we see on Earth or on another planet, that's certainly going to change. So how will that affect the patterns that we're seeing? And does that matter? I don't know. Is atmospheric composition influencing the connectivity of biotic minerals? In general, when we're dealing with biotic minerals, they're forming more towards the surface, whereas a lot of abiotic minerals tend to form deeper with a less connection to the atmosphere. So there could be a driver causing some of that similarity there as well. And one of the evaluations that we have just started is looking at the topology that we're seeing here on modern Earth and comparing that to, say, primitive meteorites, chondrites, and so on, the Hadean Earth, and big scale geologic processes like Earth evolved up to the point of plate tectonics and trying to understand what are we seeing that's a signature of a rocky planet, of plate tectonics, this big, huge process that really overrides a lot of the mineralization we see on our planet, and what is actually due to life, right? So I actually had Anirudh Prabhu is the data scientist who works with me on this, and he sent me all of those networks yesterday. So if anyone wants to go through those with me, I wasn't going to show them today. I'm like, I don't understand them well enough to show you guys. But if you guys want to go through them with me, we can absolutely do that. So just to summarize this component before I move on, we know biology has impacted Earth's mineralogy. This is really unquestionable. It's really just a matter of how. And I think that this impact is observable and quantifiable within Earth's mineral networks. And if what I'm saying is true, this is a mineralogical sign of life on a planetary scale. Now, I'd like to just really briefly talk about another sort of planetary scale in a slightly different way component of the evolutionary system of mineralogy. And we're calling that natural kind clustering. So what I just showed you was us looking at all the modes of formation and looking at the trends of mineralization within those modes of formation. But what if I have a mineral sample and I don't know how it formed? Can I predict the formational environment of a mineral specimen? You often find things in the field and you have no idea how they formed. So can we use these broad scale, planetary scale patterns and trends to be able to predict the formational environments of minerals? The answer to that is definitely yes. I'm more sure of that than I was of the previous section. But so for the the main example I'm going to talk about today is pyrite, like I promised earlier. Pyrite forms in a lot of different environments. And for instance, if I found pyrite on Mars, which I work on the Curiosity rover, we have detected pyrite, just in a very small amount, I think in one sample. But, you know, we're going to be hopefully doing sample return soon in the near future. And if I found pyrite on Mars, what does that tell me about how it formed? Well, if we go back to those graphs I showed you earlier, that brown node in the very center is pyrite, and those are all of its modes of formation. And some gratuitous pictures of beautiful pyrite because they're really cool. Pyrite forms in the most ways of any mineral, 21 different paragenetic modes. So if I hand you a piece of pyrite, how did it form? On Mars, we could make some pretty reasonable guesses, right? We could probably narrow it down to 2 or 3 different modes of formation. But it's hard to say for sure what that is, and it's also hard to say, was there biologic input into that? So we have turned to our colleagues Ross Large and Dan Gregory, who are experts in pyrite geochemistry, and they have assembled an incredible database of major, minor, trace elements, isotopic ratios for 6,000 pyrite samples, most of which were analyzed on 2 instruments. So we have this incredible data set. There are no other data sets out there like this. This is really incredible. But it's a great starting point. And so what we can do with this is use cluster analysis to determine, are there higher dimensional multivariate trends existing within these data, and are they related to their modes of formation? So here are just those results. You can see this, this is projected onto a PCA plot, and basically, we are seeing some distinct groupings there. Pyrite very clearly, based on its geochemistry, separates into high temperature and low temperature. And from there, we can further separate and figure out within the low temperature pyrite, what are the modes of formation there. So we are very close to being able to answer the question of, if I find pyrite on Mars, how did it form? And was there biological input into that formation? And we are really near there. We also have several other projects that we're working on. So if you're interested in any really, really large scale geochemical data sets, we have a lot of them published, and some of them I haven't published yet, but we just have available. The ungrouped chondrite data set is really new, and we're using that to try and understand previously misunderstood bodies in our solar system, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, so now here's where I really plug you to help me. I've told you that there are there are several, but I've shown you two systems scale mineralogical signs of life on Earth: planet-wide patterns of mineralization with mineral networks, and high-dimensional geochemical trends with cluster analysis. And I've told you that these are mineralogical signs of life on Earth. We can use this to understand mineralogical signs for other bodies in our solar system. But is that true? What about on Mars? If life existed on Mars, there's a very good chance that it was short-lived, right? Maybe it was their intermittent stages, you know? But what we know is it doesn't look like life on Earth, right? It didn't proliferate. It wasn't around for, you know, billions of years like we have on our planet. So basically, and this question really doesn't actually just come down to temporal extent, it comes down to extent in a lot of different areas. And the question really is, what is required of a biosphere to impact the overall mineralogical patterns of a planet? So this is the question that has really been bugging me recently, and I wanted to pose it here because I don't know how to answer this question by myself. And so I hope that there are some people in this room that can help me, and next week as we're doing the after shop, we can start thinking about some of the ways that we can start putting some boundaries on this and maybe start quantifying some of the things we might expect to see in the mineralogical signatures of other planetary bodies. So longevity, right? I mentioned this. How long does it have to be around? When we think about mineral crystallization, some minerals take thousands of years, but some of them take only minutes. In fact, there are minerals that form in an hour and it rains and they're washed away, right? And a lot of biomineralization occurs on actually very short timescales. So you could expect to see biomineralization happening very, very fast. However, what if we're thinking about something that is an atmospheric change, right? Of course, we had the Great Oxidation Event on Earth. You could think of similar things like this, atmospheric changes happening on other planets. How long does that take to affect the mineralogy of a planet, even the most surface layer? We've actually done a little bit of work here, a paper led by Dan Hummer. We were looking at manganese mineralization and how long it took the Great Oxidation Event to actually affect the average redox state of manganese minerals in Earth's crust, and it was about 70 million years. So we can start thinking about those types of processes, perhaps with other atmospheric changes as well. I think John posed the question earlier. What are how many different metabolic pathways are needed to, you know, sustain a population? What is the genetic diversity that is required of a microbial population in order to be resilient, in order to stick around, in order to move into different environments? What kind of environmental diversity is needed? Do we need a range of environments? My sense is that we absolutely do. I mean, if we look at the networks that we have of Earth, it requires a range of environments. So we need some environmental and genetic diversity. And are there environments that are more detectable, right? That contain stronger biological signatures? I think that's absolutely true. Of this question, I think that's something we can actually start to tackle with Earth's networks. We can start taking away different environments. We can start using metrics to determine which environments are more biological, let's say. So I think we can actually start answering that. And then what about the geographic constraints? So this really comes down to what is the geographic extent that is required, but also what is the sampling that is required? And how important is it that we're sampling unique terrains versus common terrains? If you sampled the most common rock on Earth, that would be basalt, and you'd have a if you only sampled basalt, you'd have a very, very, very different looking signature than if you were able to sample the unique terrains. So we know that that is probably very important, but how can we make sure that we're doing that, right? And again, I think this is a question that we can use Earth's network to start to assess of when do these biological trends fall apart when you start taking out these different modes of formation. So, in summary, life inherently impacts the geologic environment and the materials on our planet, and if it exists on other planets, it does the same thing there. Minerals at a planetary scale and also at a sample scale record life's impact. And how can we use what we've learned about Earth's mineralogical signs of life to detect similar biosignatures on other planetary bodies outside of our own? And with that, I would like to thank you all so much for listening, and I hope that we can talk a lot. Thank you.